The doctor's words fell like a hammer, shattering everything I thought I knew about my life. I sat there in the cold, sterile office, staring at the medical chart in front of me, the words blurring together as my mind struggled to grasp their meaning. Terminal cancer. A sickness deep in my body, spreading, irreversible. The doctor's voice droned on, explaining treatments that could buy me time, but not a cure. 6 months, maybe a year if I was lucky. Emma, my wife, sat beside me, holding my hand so tightly that my fingers ached. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with barely concealed horror. She whispered that we would fight this together, that we would make the most of whatever time we had left. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. The drive home was silent. The weight of the diagnosis hung between us, suffocating. That night, Emma curled up next to me in bed, holding on to me like she was afraid I would disappear before morning. I listened to her breathing, steady and rhythmic, as she drifted into sleep. My own sleep didn't come so easily. My mind raced, replaying the doctor's words over and over, each repetition making my impending death feel more real. The following weeks were a blur of appointments, second opinions, and desperate searches for alternatives. My body still felt normal, still strong, but inside, I knew I was decaying. Friends and family reacted with grief, their voices filled with forced optimism, their embraces lingering a second too long, as if they were memorizing the feel of me while they still could. Emma was attentive at first. She cooked my favorite meals, encouraged me to rest, scheduled appointments with specialists. But something changed. Slowly at first, so subtle that I barely noticed it. She started going out more often, staying late at work, making vague excuses. The warmth in her eyes when she looked at me dimmed, replaced by something I couldn't quite define. Then came the secrecy. The hushed phone calls in the other room, the late-night texts she hurriedly hid when I walked in. Her phone, once left casually on the table, was now always face down, locked, guarded. The soft glow of the screen in the dark as she texted someone while I lay next to her, pretending to sleep. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that stress and paranoia were playing tricks on me. I convinced myself that she was just overwhelmed, struggling to cope with the idea of losing me. But deep down, I knew better. One night, I confronted her, asking if something was wrong, if she needed to talk. She smiled, that practiced, gentle smile she had always used to reassure me. She told me I was imagining things, that I was under so much stress that I was reading into things that weren't there. And for a while, I let myself believe her. But then, the small signs turned into something undeniable. I found a receipt for a hotel in her purse. A single night stay paid for in cash. The date stamped on it was a night she had told me she was working late. I went through her car when she was in the shower, hands trembling as I searched for proof of what I already knew in my gut. A second phone hidden beneath the driver's seat. A phone I had never seen before. My stomach churned as I unlocked it, finding messages that made my blood run cold. Messages of love, a passion, plans for the future, a future without me. She wasn't waiting for me to fight. She was waiting for me to die. The realization knocked the breath from my lungs. My wife, the woman who had promised to stand by me through sickness and health, was already planning a life without me. Not grieving, not preparing for the inevitable, but moving on while I was still here. I felt like a ghost in my own home. Emma no longer looked at me the same way, no longer touched me unless necessary. She had already detached herself, already started slipping away, piece by piece, as if she were erasing me before death could. And I let her. I watched as she left for another late night at work, as she kissed my forehead with feigned affection, as she sent one last text before slipping out the door. I sat in silence, staring at the wedding photo on our shelf, at the smiling couple who had once believed in forever. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the darkness, waiting for her to return, listening as the clock ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2. When she finally came home, she moved quietly, careful not to wake me. I lay still, my heart pounding as I heard her slip into bed beside me. She smelled different, a scent I recognized but not as my own. I wanted to rage, to scream, to demand answers, but I was too tired, too defeated. The next day, I received a call from my doctor. He asked me to come in, said they needed to discuss something important. My heart clenched. More bad news. Another blow. I sat in his office once again, feeling that same cold dread creep through me. But this time, the words that left his mouth were not what I expected. There had been a mistake. A misdiagnosis. The cancer wasn't terminal. In fact, it wasn't cancer at all. The initial tests had been wrong, misinterpreted. I wasn't dying. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Relief and confusion crashed over me in waves. I wasn't dying. I had a future. But then, almost immediately, another thought struck me like lightning. Emma didn't know. She still believed I was living on borrowed time. She still believed she could wait me out, slip away into a new life while I withered. But now she would have to face the consequences of what she had done. I walked out of the doctor's office with a new purpose. I had spent weeks thinking my life was ending, watching my wife betray me in slow motion. But my story wasn't over, and neither was hers. Walking out of the doctor's office that day, I felt like I had been given a second life. The weight of my supposed death sentence had been lifted, but in its place, a new burden took hold, a revelation that cut deeper than any terminal illness ever could. I was alive, but the woman who had vowed to stand by me in sickness and in health had already abandoned me, waiting like a vulture for my last breath so she could move on without guilt. But now, she would have to face a future where I wasn't dying, where I wasn't going anywhere, and I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of an easy escape. No, she was going to live in the mess she had created, just as I had suffered through the slow realization of her betrayal. The first thing I did was keep the news to myself. I wasn't going to tell her yet, not when she was still under the illusion that her new life was just within reach. I wanted to see how far she would go. I wanted to see the full extent of her deception. That night, when I returned home, Emma greeted me with carefully rehearsed concern. She asked about my appointment, her eyes scanning me for any sign of change. I forced a tired smile, shaking my head, telling her there was nothing new to report. I watched as relief flickered across her face. So brief I might have missed it if I hadn't been looking for it. She was relieved that I was still dying. That night, I lay awake in bed beside her, listening to the soft taps of her fingers on her phone screen. I imagined the words she was typing, messages sent in secret, a future planned in whispers. I no longer felt the crushing heartbreak of before. Now all I felt was cold, calculated patience. In the following days, I pretended nothing had changed. I played the part of the resigned, dying husband while she played the grieving, devoted wife in public. Behind closed doors, the cracks in her act became more visible. She spent more nights away, claiming she needed time to clear her mind, that the stress of my illness was wearing her down. I nodded, understanding, playing along. She had no idea that I was watching her, gathering everything I needed. I installed a small GPS tracker in her car, a simple device that would log every place she went. I went through our phone records, documenting the repeated calls to an unsaved number, her lover, no doubt. I searched through the second phone I had found in her car, taking screenshots of every text, every whispered confession of love and longing. They spoke of a future together, of how hard it was to pretend around me, how soon it would all be over. I read it all with quiet detachment. Every sentence was a new knife in my back, but I refused to let it break me. I let it fuel me instead. Then I took the first real step toward my revenge. One evening, Emma told me she was going out to meet a friend, a woman from work. I acted as if I believed her, giving her a weak, tired smile as I lay on the couch. As soon as she was out the door, I checked the GPS tracker. She wasn't going to meet any friend. She was headed to a hotel across town. I drove there in silence, parking a few spaces away from where her car sat. I waited, watching, heart pounding even though my mind was clear. Minutes later, she emerged from the lobby with a man I recognized immediately. I had seen his face in the photos, read his pathetic declarations of love in her messages. He was older than I expected, well-dressed, the kind of man who carried himself with undeserved confidence. They kissed before getting into his car and driving away. I followed, They went to a restaurant one Emma and I had gone to on special occasions. I watched as they laughed over wine, hands touching across the table, faces lit with the kind of joy she no longer showed around me. I took pictures not because I needed them, I already had more than enough evidence, but because I wanted something tangible to remind me why I was doing this. When they left, I didn't follow. I had seen enough. Now it was time to set my plan into motion. The next morning, while Emma was in the shower, I sat at the dining table, my laptop open, carefully compiling everything I had gathered. The GPS records, the phone logs, the messages, the pictures from the hotel, the restaurant. I made sure it was all neatly arranged in a folder labeled with her name. Then I made 3 copies. One would go to her parents, who had always adored me and who believed their daughter to be incapable of such cruelty. One would go to her workplace, where her spotless reputation as a respectable employee would be tainted by the affair she had carried on so recklessly. And the last copy? That one I would give to her myself, but not yet. No, I wanted her to think she had one first. For days I continued to play my role. I let her think I was still weak, still blind. I let her walk through the house with the arrogance of someone who believed they had already gotten away with everything. She had no idea that the ground beneath her was already crumbling. The night before I revealed the truth, she came home late, reeking of his cologne. She kissed my forehead, a ghost of the affection she once had for me, and told me she was sorry she hadn't been around more, that she loved me. I almost laughed. Instead, I looked up at her, held her gaze, and told her I understood, that I forgave her. She smiled, and in that moment I knew. She truly believed she had one. Tomorrow she would learn just how wrong she was. The morning of my reckoning arrived with an eerie calm. The sun cast a golden glow through the windows, painting a picture of a world that still spun as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Today, the life Emma had been carefully constructing behind my back would come crumbling down, piece by piece, and I would be the one to light the match. I moved through my routine deliberately, making breakfast, sipping coffee, watching her as she prepared for her day. She hummed softly, a habit she once had when we were happy. But now, the sound only reminded me of the deception she wove so effortlessly. She had no idea that this was the last morning she would ever wake up in this house as my wife. She kissed my cheek before heading out the door, murmuring a rushed excuse about an early meeting. I watched her leave, her perfume lingering in the air like a ghost of the past. The moment she was out of sight, I went to my laptop and sent the first email. The file containing every piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered. The texts, the GPS logs, the photos was sent to her parents first. They had always been fond of me, had always spoken highly of the way I treated their daughter. I wondered what they would say now, faced with undeniable proof that their perfect daughter had been waiting for my death while building a future with another man. The second email went to her workplace. The affair itself wasn't their business, but the fact that it involved a senior manager certainly was. I made sure the message was professional, factual, impossible to ignore. Emma had built a career based on her reliability, her integrity. That image would not survive the day. The third and final message was scheduled to be sent in exactly 1 hour, to Emma herself. She would receive it at the precise moment I was ready to confront her, when there would be no way for her to twist the truth, no escape left. I waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then my phone buzzed. Emma's mother. I let it ring. I didn't need to hear the pain in her voice, the confusion, the frantic attempts to rationalize what she had just seen. Another call came through moments later, her father. Then a third, this time from her work. It had begun. Finally, Emma's number flashed across my screen. I answered. Her voice was frantic, shaken. She had received the email. She demanded to know where I was, pleaded for me to talk to her in person. I told her to come home. When she arrived, she looked different. The usual poise, the carefully curated mask of confidence, was gone. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale. She had spent the drive home crying. She stepped inside hesitantly, eyes darting around like a trapped animal. I said nothing, just watched as she tried to compose herself, tried to summon the charm that had once fooled me so completely. Then I dropped the final bombshell. I told her about the misdiagnosis, that I wasn't dying, that I was going to live. Her breath caught. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. I saw it then. The raw panic, the realization that everything she had counted on had crumbled. She had thought she would be free soon, that she would be able to step into her new life without guilt. But now she was trapped. She fell apart. She sobbed, begged, tried to explain. She claimed she had been lost, that she hadn't known how to cope, that she had made a mistake. But I wasn't interested in her excuses. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. I told her to leave. Not in a rage, not with shouting, but with a cold finality that left no room for argument. She tried to resist, tried to convince me that we could fix this, that she still loved me. But there was nothing left between us, nothing to salvage. She packed a bag, hesitating at the door, looking back at me with pleading eyes. I didn't flinch. When she realized there was nothing left to say, she walked out, and just like that, she was gone. I stood in the silence of the house we had once shared, breathing in the air of a future that was mine alone now. Emma had been waiting for my death. Now she was the one left with nothing. But my revenge wasn't over yet. In the days that followed, I watched the aftermath unfold from a distance. The messages from her family came first. Pleas for an explanation, for clarity, for any possible way to make sense of what she had done. Her father, a proud man who had always seen his daughter as an example of success and decency, was furious beyond words. He disowned her, cutting her off financially, refusing to even hear her excuses. Her mother's messages were softer, filled with desperation and disbelief, but even she couldn't deny the truth of what I had shown them. Then came her career. Her company wasted no time in distancing itself from her. The senior manager she had been having an affair with was forced to resign, and though Emma wasn't fired immediately, the scandal tainted her reputation beyond repair. The colleagues who once respected her now looked at her with judgment, with whispered conversations in the break room, with quiet disdain. Within a week, she quit. I heard from mutual acquaintances that she had moved into a tiny apartment on the outskirts of town. The life she had been building, the future she had so eagerly anticipated, had vanished before it could even begin. I could have left it at that. But there was one last thing I needed to do. I drafted a letter, carefully worded, devoid of anger but filled with cold truth. I detailed what she had done, how she had abandoned me when she thought I was dying, how she had betrayed the vows we had once shared. And then, in the final paragraph, I told her something that I knew would haunt her forever. I was ready to die believing you loved me. Now, I will live knowing you never did. I sent it and never looked back. For the first time in months, I felt free. Emma's world was crumbling, and I watched from a distance as the pieces fell apart. I wasn't the one to physically remove her from her life, but I had set everything in motion. One action after another, like dominoes knocking down everything she had built. Her betrayal had been planned, calculated. An escape she thought would come at the cost of my life. But she had made one fatal mistake. She underestimated the dead man walking. In the days following our final conversation, she tried to contact me, over and over. Calls, messages, emails, even voicemails where her voice cracked under the weight of regret. I listened to them once, each more desperate than the last, then deleted them without a second thought. She had nothing left to say that I cared to hear. Her family had cast her out. Her father, once proud of the daughter he had raised, wanted nothing to do with her. Her mother, though softer in her disappointment, had made it clear that trust was something Emma had shattered beyond repair. She had become the black sheep, a pariah in her own bloodline, exiled by the very people she had thought would always stand by her. Then there was her career. Emma had worked hard to build a reputation of professionalism and integrity, but the revelation of her affair had poisoned that beyond saving. The senior manager she had entangled herself with had been forced to resign, but the taint of the scandal still clung to her like a stain that wouldn't wash away. I heard through mutual contacts that she had been passed over for a promotion she had been expecting, and soon after, she resigned altogether. Or maybe she was pushed out. Either way, she no longer had the security she had relied on. Now she was alone, jobless, and abandoned. Everything she had been building, everything she had gambled our marriage for, had turned to dust. I should have felt satisfied. I had won, hadn't I? But as I sat in the quiet of my house, the house that no longer held the echoes of her presence, I realized that victory felt strangely hollow. My life was my own again, but it had been rebuilt on the ashes of something that was once love. That thought didn't break me, but it lingered like a ghost, refusing to fade completely. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old belongings, I found a box of letters Emma had written me when we were younger. Love notes, anniversary cards, reminders of a time when I truly believed she was my forever. I hesitated for a long moment before placing them in a bag and taking them outside to burn. The fire swallowed the past, turning each piece of paper into nothing more than smoke drifting into the sky. And as I watched, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Emma had already lost more than I could have ever taken from her. There was no need to hold onto the weight of what had happened. That night, I received a final message from her. Unlike the others, this one was different, short, simple. A single sentence. I don't know how to live with what I've done. I didn't respond. Emma would have to find her own way forward, just as I had found mine. But fate wasn't quite done with us yet. A week later, I was in a coffee shop across town, sipping my drink and enjoying the quiet hum of strangers' conversations, when I saw her. Emma. She looked different, thinner. Her once perfectly styled hair now a tangled mess, dark circles carved beneath her eyes. She moved without her usual confidence, as if she were carrying a weight she couldn't put down. She didn't see me, and I made no effort to be seen. I simply watched as she ordered her coffee, her hands trembling as she reached for her wallet. She fumbled, dropping a few bills onto the floor, and for the briefest moment, I considered standing up, helping her. Old instincts, long buried, stirred within me, but I stayed where I was. Emma was not my problem anymore. I left before she could notice me, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air, breathing deeply as I walked down the street. I didn't look back. Days turned into weeks and I slowly rebuilt. I traveled, something I had always wanted to do but had put off for too long. I spent time with friends, reconnecting with the people I had unknowingly distanced myself from during my illness. And most importantly, I allowed myself to heal. Every now and then, I would hear bits and pieces about Emma through mutual acquaintances. How she had moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. How she barely spoke to anyone. How she had become a shadow of the person she once was. But I didn't seek her out. She was no longer my concern. For the first time in a long time, I was free. And yet, some nights, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she ever truly regretted it. If she had known, deep in her heart, that she had destroyed not just our marriage, but herself in the process. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. Time moved forward, indifferent to the wreckage left behind. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, the weight of Emma's betrayal lessened. The anger had long since faded, replaced by something quieter, something closer to indifference. She had been waiting for my death, convinced that my time was running out. Now, it was she who had lost everything, while I had been given a second chance at life. I embraced that second chance fully. I traveled, something I had always planned to do but had put off for later. I reconnected with old friends, strengthening bonds that had frayed over the years. I took up hobbies I had once abandoned, finding joy in the little things that had once seemed trivial. For the first time in a long time, I was truly living. Emma, on the other hand, had faded into the background. Mutual acquaintances rarely mentioned her anymore, and when they did, it was with a sense of discomfort, as if they were speaking about someone who no longer existed. I knew she had moved into a small, run-down apartment far from the life she had once envisioned for herself. Her career, once promising, had crumbled in the wake of her scandal. Her family had not welcomed her back, and her so-called lover had long since disappeared. For a long time, I found myself wondering what she was doing. It wasn't because I missed her. Those emotions had long since turned to dust. But curiosity lingered, not in the form of longing, but as a lingering thought, an unanswered question. What became of her when the life she had planned no longer existed? Then, one evening, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity won out. The handwriting was unmistakable, Emma's. The letter was short, unpolished, lacking the confidence she once carried in her words. She wrote that she wasn't expecting a response, that she wasn't even sure why she was writing. But she needed me to know that she thought about what she had done every single day, that the weight of her choices pressed down on her like an anchor, that she had destroyed herself far more thoroughly than I ever could have. She admitted she had been selfish, blinded by her own desires, convinced that she could step into a new life without consequences. She had been wrong. She had lost everything, and now she had to live with that. She detailed how she had spent the last few months barely getting by. She was working a menial job, one far below her qualifications, barely scraping together enough to cover rent. The friends who had once surrounded her had long since disappeared, unwilling to associate themselves with someone whose fall from grace had been so public. She was, for the first time in her life, truly alone. There was no plea for forgiveness, no request for a second chance. Just a quiet acknowledgement of her downfall, and the knowledge that she would never outrun the guilt. I sat with the letter for a long time before folding it neatly and placing it in a drawer. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Life went on. Months turned into a year, and I continued to move forward. I found a quiet peace in the simplicity of my days, no longer haunted by the betrayal that once consumed me. I had built a new life, one that was mine alone, and I refused to let the past have any hold over me. Then, one evening, I found myself in the same coffee shop I had once seen Emma in months before. I didn't expect to see her again, but fate had other plans. She was there, sitting alone in a corner, staring blankly at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her once vibrant eyes were empty, her posture slumped as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. She didn't see me, and I didn't approach her. Instead, I watched for a moment, realizing that she was no longer the woman I had once loved, nor the woman who had betrayed me. She was something else entirely, a cautionary tale, a ghost of a life that had crumbled under the weight of its own lies. I left without a word, stepping into the crisp evening air, inhaling deeply. For the first time, I felt closure. Emma's fate was no longer my concern. Her suffering, her regrets, her loneliness, those were her burdens to carry, just as I had once carried mine. I met someone new not long after that. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, and it didn't need to be. It was built on trust, on honesty, on the understanding that love is not something to be taken for granted. She knew about my past, about the scars Emma had left, but she didn't see me as broken. She saw me as whole. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my new home, watching the sun set over a horizon that stretched endlessly before me, I realized something. Emma had been my past, but she would never be my future. I had survived, and in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all.